Today, we're looking at the correlation between U.S. presidential elections and car sales. We'll also see what car giants are forecasting for the future of EVs and whether or not this is good news for gas-powered cars. Stellantis is currently moving forward with its Dare Forward 2030 plan. This is the plan where Stellantis committed to reach 100% battery electric vehicle sales in Europe and 50% in the U.S. by the start of 2030. But recently, Stellantis is also forecasting dark clouds on the horizon. CEO Carlos Tavares said that EV adoption may be about to shift into the slow lane. He gave a statement outside of Stellantis' Mirafiori plant in Italy, where he explained that public opinion is currently shifting away from EVs and may end up slowing down overall EV sales in the future. Because of these elections, we'll see a shift in politics, which will trickle over into the EV industry. We may see an unfavorable political climate towards EVs. That would especially be the case if CO2 regulations get rolled back. And that's why Stellantis has already begun preparing plans for these possible new conditions. It makes you wonder just how much a presidential election can impact an industry, specifically the EV industry. We can already see the political climate isn't painting a very positive picture when it comes to pushing mass EV adoption. It's not just Stellantis that's talking about politics shifting the car industry. So is Ford Motors. Back this past October, Bill Ford, who is the executive and great-grandson of Henry Ford, admitted he never thought he'd see the day when Ford's products would be so heavily politicized. Anyway, the question is, what exactly is the correlation between the U.S. presidential election and car sales? Let's break it down. First of all, elections are notorious for spreading economic uncertainty across the country. Reason is, consumers don't know what's in store for the future. The uncertainty influences mainstream consumer purchasing behavior, and many actually hold back from making big purchases, like a new car, for example. Then, usually after the election, there's a seismic jump in sales. True, not all these changes come immediately after an election. It usually takes time. But it's these long-term impacts of post-election time that can end up being the most significant. Just recall how Obama created the Affordable Care Act, now known as Obamacare. But then incoming President Trump tried to repeal and undo all that. The point is, when presidents change, so can U.S. policies. And as far as cars are concerned, just think of the fuel efficiency standards, EV subsidies, tariffs, and so forth. Just take a look at what happened during the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections. And maybe you can see a pattern. In general, during the weeks leading up to each election, sales of new cars fell. In fact, that's why before the election, many dealerships pushed out election year discounts to try to boost sales. Data shows that car aggregators, marketplaces, and new and used car dealerships saw a significant jump in prospective buyers after Election Day. One caveat, of course, is that this is historical, pre-pandemic and pandemic data. So now that we're post-pandemic and our country is in a different state, who knows how things will turn out? Here's what we do know. The fact is, EV sales have been slowing down for some time now. EVs are piling up across the country. On average, it was found that EVs sit in the market for 82 days. To put that in perspective, gas-powered vehicles sit in the market for 64 days. In August 2023, it took about twice as long to sell an EV in the U.S. as it did the previous January. So the question is, why are EV sales slowing down when there are more EV incentives than ever before? Actually, there's a few reasons. Now, don't get me wrong, EV prices are dropping. Remember Tesla's massive price cuts? But here's the thing. Even with these price cuts and tax incentives, EVs are still too expensive for the average Joe. Sure, people are concerned about an EV's battery range, also known as range anxiety. But the high price of EVs is the top concern for most consumers. Even with all the price cuts we've seen these past couple of months, the average EV price back in October was still 28% higher than for a gas-powered vehicle. And that's just the sticker price. Then you throw in all the costs that come with actually owning an EV. EV insurance costs more, and home chargers cost money. Installing one at-home charger can set you back up to $2,000 up front. Data shows that the first 5 years of owning an EV is also higher compared to owning a gas-powered vehicle. Last February 2023, EVs cost consumer an average of $65,202 during the first 5 years of ownership, whereas gas-powered vehicles cost owners $56,962 during that same period. Now you might be thinking, but aren't EV maintenance costs cheaper? At first, sure, but because EVs are a lot heavier than gas-powered vehicles, chances are you'll be running through your tires faster and need to buy new tires a lot more often. Batteries aren't cheap either if you later encounter problems and you need a replacement. Some are over $20,000. But sky-high purchase price and maintenance costs aren't the only thing slowing down EV sales. One survey found that 77% of Americans are worried about the lack of EV charging stations. You can't blame them since the national charging network is still in its early days. 73% of those surveyed worry about EV battery life. On top of that, 57% said it wasn't likely that their next purchase would be a fully electric vehicle or even a plug-in hybrid. EV sales have also slowed because consumers are generally unfamiliar with EVs. The more unfamiliar something is, the longer it'll take to warm up to it. Sure, tech lover and early adopters couldn't wait to get their hands on an EV, despite initial limited supplies and high prices. But now that the first wave of buyers have passed and car brands are left with the rest of mainstream America, I'm talking about the average Joe here. Also, consider the fact that EVs typically have a poor depreciation record. Last year, the average used EV price saw almost a 20% drop. Drops like this scare away consumers from buying because they have no idea how well their EV will hold its value if and when they decide to sell it later down the road. I recently saw 1-year-old Volvo electric cars sell for as little as $25,000 with 15,000 miles on them, and understand the original list price was over $60,000. Now, when it comes down to it, switching over to an EV is a lifestyle choice. An EV simply doesn't fit everyone's lifestyle, at least not now. If you drive an EV, you need to be able to keep your driving trips short. You have to have EV chargers nearby, and you need time to charge your car too. If you're able to use a DC fast charger, that significantly decreases charging time. But realize it will also shorten the lifespan of your battery. That's why Stellantis is preparing in case EV sales continue to fall. If you don't already know, Stellantis is made up of 14 brands and 2 mobility arms: Abarth, Alfa Romeo, Chrysler, Citroen, Dodge, DS Automotive, Fiat, Jeep, Lancia, Maserati, Opel, Peugeot, Ram, Vauxhall, Free to Move, and Lexus. Actually, the Stellantis group was only established in 2021. It's actually a 50-50 merger between Fiat Chrysler Automobiles and Peugeot's parent company, the PSA Group. If you look at the top 10 largest vehicle makers in the U.S. by market share, Stellantis rates as number 4. Since we're talking today about the EV climate, guess where Tesla lines up? Believe it or not, it's the 9th largest vehicle maker in the U.S. by market share. And the number 1 spot is GM, which owns 17% market share. Toyota comes close with 15%, followed by Ford, which controls 14%. Anyway, sales of EVs might be waning, but competition is not. New players keep joining the EV game. Believe it or not, some electrical grid operators in the United States are already struggling to keep up with demand in certain areas and at certain times. Take California, for instance. Last September, California power authorities asked residents to avoid charging their electric vehicles in the evening during the heat wave so that the power grid wouldn't be overloaded by people running air conditioners. That's where they stand right now. So imagine how worse things will get as Americans buy more EVs. Speaking of California, did you know that Palo Alto has the highest EV adoption rate than any other city in the United States? Get this, Palo Alto has 25,000 households. Of those, 1 out of every 6 households own at least one EV as we speak. That's some 4,500 EVs out of the 52,000 vehicles registered in the city. Plus, on top of that, during the work week, commuters from the surrounding area drive another 3,000 to 5,000 EVs into the city. One of the reasons Palo Alto has the most EVs is due to the local government's aggressive sustainability and climate action plan. Its goal is to reduce the city's greenhouse gas emissions to 80% below the 1990 level, and that's all by 2030. Compare that to the entire state of California. The state goal is to achieve the same amount by 2050. In other words, the state has 20 additional years to achieve the goal. So you can see why Palo Alto has an aggressive plan. Anyway, to meet the 2030 emissions reduction goals, Palo Alto will most likely increase the amount of local renewable energy that's being used for electricity generation. Palo Alto has already given its residents incentives to purchase EVs and charging ports. But let's look at the U.S. as a whole. Utility companies in other states have also warned of rolling blackout periods to prevent total system collapse. Well, I'll tell you now, there's good news and bad news. Let's start with the good. There are many experts who think that utility industry will be ready to generate enough power for the coming EV wave. That's because of capacity increases that are already in the works. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in investment. But the bad news is there's a serious threat to bottlenecks in the local grids that transmit electricity to the individual homes and businesses. To generate the extra electricity needed to charge more and more EVs, neighborhood power distribution systems need expensive upgrades. Plus, as more electric trucks and delivery vans hit the roads, more money will be needed to upgrade the wires and transformers that serve these commercial sites. And analysts believe that these expensive investments will just end up pushing up the price of electricity, which is only common sense. In other words, at the end of the day, we the consumer will ultimately end up eating the cost of ramping up the power grid. Because of these forecasts, there's much debate on what's the best solution to deal with higher demand for electricity. There's one line of thinking that says companies can manage the demand by controlling when EVs are charged. For example, encourage less charging when electricity is at peak hours by varying the cost of electricity or offering incentives. Anyway, to understand what needs to be done and prepared, you have to understand the three major components of the electrical system. I'm talking mainly about power generation, long-distance electric transmission, and finally, local distribution. Let's start with power generation. Here in the U.S., we have some 12,000 utility-scale power plants. I'm talking about power plants that generate the electricity by burning natural gas, coal, oil, or splitting atoms, or harnessing energy from green sources like the sun, wind, or water. The good news is, right now, EV charging consumes just a small part of all our power production in the States. And when I say small, I mean very small. A recent study found that in 2021, the 2.1 million EVs across the U.S. consumed less than 0.2% of the total watt hours of power consumed that year. So one question could be, how much of electricity will EVs consume when all Americans go EV? Well, the answer depends on who you ask. According to the Electric Power Research Institute, from 2021 to 2030, all types of EVs, including commercial trucks and buses, will increase America's overall electricity consumption somewhere between 8% to 13%. But here's the thing, EV charging isn't the only thing that's going to affect future power generation. Analysts expect power demand will increase in general. For example, some local governments are already deterring and will eventually disallow the installation of gas stoves and gas furnaces. Instead, they want residents to use electric stoves and furnaces. It's not like power companies have never dealt with big increases in electricity demand before. They have, if you're old enough to remember. Think back to the era when air conditioning was becoming more mainstream. That was 50 years ago. More AC installations meant more electricity consumption. Or if you want to look at a more recent example, just think of how popular cloud storage is nowadays and how it's possible because of the construction of massive data centers. Now, while power companies have dealt with big increases in electricity demand before, the problem is it's hard to predict the speed of EV adoption. There are just too many variables involved. I'm talking things like gas prices, buildup of public charging stations, the price and availability of EVs, the continuation of government incentives, and so forth. Consider, too, the power companies know years in advance about the arrival of new housing developments, shopping centers, and factories that will soon demand more electricity. So there, they have time to prepare and upgrade their facilities. But it's a lot less predictable with electric vehicles. Right now, there's a lot of pressure to ramp up power production for EV charging. I'm talking about regulations, environmental groups, and even investors who want electric companies to stay away from coal and gas-fired plants completely. But look, if you shut down those plants, you still need to replace their electricity output with something else. And don't forget the challenge of sourcing all required materials. As it is right now, we're already seeing supply chain backlogs for larger poles, transmission lines, and other important components. It's a huge mess as it is. Then we have the third and last main piece of the electrical system. I'm talking about local power distribution, which will largely impact when America fully electrifies. Here's why. At the local level, electricity voltage has to be reduced so it can be safely sent through the local grid. Once it's sent through the local grid, wires take all that electricity into the neighborhoods, stores, and offices. From there, transformers reduce the voltage even more to either 120 or 240 volts. But here's where the problems start. Charging an EV could mean a major boost to the electricity transmitting capacity of the wires and transformers in a residential household not set up for that much power. I'm talking a 70% to 130% increase depending on the power of the charger. That's huge. And it won't be cheap. Through 2030, utility companies need to invest anywhere between $1,700 and $5,800 in power grid improvements for each light-duty electric vehicle sold. And when it comes to the general power power industry, nationwide costs for this work could surpass $10 billion through 2030. So while utility companies will expect to gain a lot of revenue from EV households, it may not be enough to cover the needed upgrades. So to fix this problem, utility companies may likely need to increase the cost of electricity up to 12%. Here's yet another problem, and that's charging commercial EVs at industrial parks, warehouses, and package depots. Reason is, these types of heavy-duty commercial EVs typically need a lot more electricity than the average passenger EV. Then there's the unpredictable wild card of figuring out how local grids will distribute power to supply public charging stations. All this extra pressure on the local distribution grid could mean serious backlogs in equipment and shortages of workers to install them. I'm talking months or even years to install new infrastructure. But now you tell me. They say the U.S. has 290 million cars on the road right now. If that kind of volume were to electrify hypothetically by 2030, do you think our power grid will be able to handle it? Or will it get fried? Please share by commenting below. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for your support.